Sometimes the loneliest people have the biggest hearts, they've just forgotten how to use them. Judah Cain thought love died with his wife 15 years ago. He lived alone on his Montana ranch until a storm brought a barefoot woman to his door. She was cold, hungry, and had nowhere else to go. When he saw her collapsed in the mud, something inside him broke open. "Come inside now," he shouted through the wind. That night changed everything. She stayed for the storm, but somehow never left, and the cowboy who thought he'd never love again discovered that sometimes the person who needs saving is you. But what happens when two broken souls find warmth in each other's silence and discover that healing doesn't always come with words? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun hadn't yet painted the Montana sky when Judah Cain stepped onto his porch, coffee steaming in the bitter February air. 15 years of this same ritual boots on weathered planks, steam rising from his cup like prayers he'd stopped saying long ago. The ranch stretched before him, 3,000 acres of rolling grassland now buried under February snow, dotted with the dark shapes of cattle huddled against the wind. He'd built this life with his own hands, every fence post and barn beam a testament to what a man could accomplish when he had nothing left to lose. The house behind him stood solid and square, built to last generations, though he'd long since accepted he'd be the last Cain to call it home. Sarah had dreamed of filling these rooms with children's laughter. Now the silence was so complete he sometimes forgot the sound of his own voice. The wooden box sat on his nightstand, untouched for months at a time, holding the thin gold band that had circled Sarah's finger for exactly 18 months and 12 days. He'd counted every one of them, first in joy, then in grief, so sharp it could cut a man in half. She'd been 19 when they married, 20 when the fever took her, and in between had been the brightest light he'd ever known. Some men, he reckoned, got a lifetime of love. He'd gotten 20 months and considered himself lucky for it. The woman Rowan, she'd whispered when he'd asked, had slept through the night on his sofa, wrapped in his mother's quilt. He'd checked on her twice, careful not to wake her, struck by how small she looked, curled beneath the heavy wool. Her clothes had been soaked through, threadbare cotton that wouldn't have kept a sparrow warm. He'd given her one of his old shirts and hung her dress by the fire, though he doubted it would ever be the same. Morning chores called, and Judah set his cup aside, pulling on the thick coat that had seen him through a dozen winters. The barn was warm with animal heat, filled with the soft sounds of horses nickering and cattle lowing. His hands moved through familiar motion in the mangers, grain in the troughs, checking hooves and counting heads. Work was salvation. Work was the only thing that made sense when nothing else did. He'd been born on this land, raised by a father who believed in hard work and honest dealing, taught by a mother who could make a dollar stretch like taffy and a meal feed twice as many as it should. They'd both passed now, buried in the small cemetery on the hill where Sarah lay beneath the cottonwood she'd loved. 3 graves under one tree, and space beside them for a fourth that would come in time. The woman Rowan was awake when he returned to the house, standing by the window in his oversized shirt, watching the snow fall. She turned when he entered, and he was struck again by her eyes, dark as winter pine, and holding secrets he couldn't fathom. "Storm's getting worse," he said, hanging his coat on the peg by the door. "Radio says it might last another day or two." She nodded, hands wrapped around the cup of coffee she'd somehow managed to make while he was gone. "I should go," she said quietly. "I don't want to be trouble." "Where would you go?" The question came out sharper than he'd intended, and he saw her flinch. He gentled his voice. "Road's already snowed over. Even if it wasn't, you'd freeze before you made it a mile." She looked down at her bare feet, toes peeking out from beneath his shirt. "I lost my shoes somewhere." "In the mud," he said. "Saw them when I brought you in." They weren't much to begin with. He studied her face, noting the exhaustion etched in the lines around her eyes, the way she held herself carefully, as if something might break. "You running from something?" The question hung between them like smoke from the fire. She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Yes. He waited, but she offered nothing more. In his experience, people told you what they needed you to know when they were ready to tell it. Pushing only made them close up tighter than a morning glory at sunset. Well, he said finally, whatever it is, it's not getting through this storm. Neither are you, so I reckon we're stuck with each other for a spell. Something shifted in her expression, relief, maybe, or gratitude. She took a sip of coffee and looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time. The house was simple but well built, furnished with pieces his mother had chosen and his father had crafted. Nothing fancy, but everything solid and meant to last. It's a beautiful home, she said. It'll do. He moved to the stove, checking the fire, adding another log. You hungry? I was about to start breakfast. I can cook, she said quickly. I mean, if you'd like, I'm a good cook. There was something desperate in the offer, as if she needed to prove her worth. He wondered what kind of life taught a woman to barter her usefulness for basic human kindness. I'm sure you are, he said carefully, but you're a guest. Guests don't cook. I'm not a guest, she said, and there was steel beneath the softness now. I'm a woman who collapsed on your porch in the middle of a storm. You don't owe me anything, and I don't expect charity. He turned to face her fully, struck by the pride in her voice despite everything. What's your last name, Rowan? Mackey. Well, Mrs. Mackey. Miss, she corrected quickly, just Miss. He filed that information away with everything else he was learning about Hearth. Careful way she moved, the shadows in her eyes, the fact that she'd been traveling alone in winter without proper clothes or shoes. A story was forming in his mind, and he didn't like where it was heading. Miss Mackey, he said, in my experience, when the good Lord sends someone to your door in the middle of a blizzard, it's not by accident. Maybe you're here because I needed the company. Maybe I'm here because you needed the shelter. Either way, we're going to get along just fine until this weather clears. She studied his face, as if trying to determine whether he meant it. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded once, sharp and decisive. Then let me earn my keep, she said. I can cook, clean, mend. I'm not afraid of hard work. I don't doubt it. He pulled eggs from the icebox, set them on the counter. But first, let's just get through breakfast. Everything else can wait. They worked side by side in comfortable silence, she scrambling eggs while he fried salt pork and made biscuits. She moved with practiced efficiency, and he found himself watching the way she handled the spatula, the careful way she seasoned the eggs. Whoever had taught her to cook had done it right. When they sat down to eat, the storm howling outside the windows, Judah found himself thinking about the box on his nightstand and the ring inside it. For the first time in 15 years, he wasn't eating breakfast alone. The thought should have made him feel guilty. Sarah's chair, Sarah's table, Sarah's kitchen. Instead, he felt something that might have been peace. Tell me about the ranch, Rowan said, breaking the comfortable quiet. So he did. He told her about his grandfather homesteading the land, his father building it into something profitable, the years he'd spent learning every inch of grass and stone. He told her about the cattle, the horses, the way the seasons moved across the valley like a slow, predictable dance. He found himself talking more than he had in years, drawn out by her genuine interest and intelligent questions. When the meal was finished, she cleared the dishes without being asked, moving around his kitchen as if she belonged there. The thought struck him like lightning she fit. In his space, in his morning routine, in the comfortable silence that had always been his alone. It was dangerous thinking, and he pushed it away. The storm raged for 3 days, 3 days of shared meals and quiet conversation, of her mending his shirts while he repaired harness leather, of catching her humming softly while she worked. 3 days of discovering that solitude wasn't the same thing as peace, and that some kinds of loneliness were so deep you didn't even know you were drowning until someone threw you a rope. On the 4th morning, the sun broke through the clouds, painting the snow-covered world in shades of gold and pink. Judah stood on his porch with his coffee, listening to the profound silence that followed a storm. Behind him, he could hear Rowan moving around the kitchen, starting breakfast for both of them, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The road would be passable soon. Whatever she was running from, whatever life she'd left behind, would be waiting for her beyond his gates. The thought settled in his chest like a stone. It was while hanging laundry on the line behind the house that Judah first saw the bruises. The wind had caught Rowan's sleeve, pushing it up past her wrist, revealing fingerprints dark as storm clouds against her pale skin. She tugged the fabric down quickly, but not before he'd seen enough to make his jaw clench tight as a bear trap. He didn't say anything, not then. But that night, when she thought he was asleep in his chair by the fire, he watched her favor her left side, the careful way she moved, as if something still hurt, deep inside. The torn dress he'd found her in lay folded in a drawer upstairs, and now he understood why she'd clutched it so tight when he'd offered to throw it away. The fabric was good quality once, blue wool that would have been warm if it hadn't been ripped at the shoulder and stained with something that looked suspiciously like blood. He'd seen enough bar fights and ranch accidents to recognize the signs of violence, and the dress told a story he wished he didn't understand. "Judah," she said on the fifth morning, her voice careful as she set his coffee down, "I need to tell you something." He looked up from the ledger where he was recording feed costs, seeing the way she wrung her hands in the apron she'd taken to wearing. It had been his mother's, and seeing it tied around Rowan's waist did something strange to his chest. "I'm listening." She sat across from him at the kitchen table, the same spot she'd claimed those first few days. Her fingers traced patterns on the wooden surface, and he could see her gathering courage like a woman preparing to jump off a cliff. "My husband," she began, then stopped, shaking her head. "My former husband. He's not a good man, Judah. He has a temper, and when he drinks—" She touched her ribs unconsciously. "I stayed too long, made excuses, thought I could fix him somehow." The words hung in the air between them like gunpowder waiting for a spark. Judah kept his expression neutral, though inside, something dark and protective was unfurling in his chest. "What made you leave?" he asked quietly. "He sold me." The words came out flat, matter of fact, as if she were discussing livestock. "To another man, for gambling debts. Said I was no good as a wife anyway, might as well be useful for something." The chair creaked as Judah's hands tightened on the armrests. In all his years, through war and hardship and grief, he'd never felt rage quite like this, cold and clean and purposeful as a blade. "I ran that night," Rowan continued, her voice stronger now. "Took nothing but the clothes on my back. Walked for 2 days before the storm caught me. That's when I found your place." "He'll come looking," Judah said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." She met his eyes directly for the first time since she'd started talking. "He doesn't like to lose things he considers his, even if he never wanted them to begin with." Judah pushed back from the table, needing to move, needing to think. He walked to the window that looked out over his land, 3,000 acres of peace he'd carved out of wilderness and grief. A place where nothing ugly was supposed to touch down. "What's his name?" "Marcus Whitmore. He owns property in Helena, has friends in important places. People believe him when he talks." Her voice went quiet again. "They don't believe me." The name meant nothing to Judah, but he filed it away alongside everything else. A man who would sell his wife like chattel, who would put those bruises on skin softer than morning mist. The kind of man who gave decent folk a bad name. "How long before he figures out where you went?" "I don't know. I tried to cover my tracks, but—" She shrugged helplessly. "He's got resources, money. He can hire people to look." Judah turned from the window, studying her face. Fear lived there, deep and bone deep, but also something else. A kind of quiet determination that reminded him of his mother facing down a rabid dog with nothing but a broom and pure stubborn will. "You could keep running," he said. "I could." She straightened in her chair. "But I'm tired of running, tired of being afraid, and—" She stopped, color rising in her cheeks. "And what?" "And I like it here." The admission came out soft as a prayer. "I like the work, the quiet. I like the way you treat me like I'm worth something. I know I don't have any right to stay, but—" "You have every right." The words came out fiercer than he'd intended, and he saw her blink in surprise. "This is my land, my house. I say who's welcome and who's not." Something shifted in her expression, hope flickering like candlelight in a draught. "You'd let me stay, even knowing he'll come?" Judah walked back to the table, sat down across from her again. For 15 years, he'd lived his life in careful isolation, avoiding complications, keeping his heart locked away where it couldn't be broken again. Now this woman had appeared on his doorstep like an answer to a question he'd never known he was asking. "I've got a rifle," he said simply, "and I know how to use it." She laughed, short and sharp, with more tears than humor in it. "You don't understand. Marcus has money, connections. He can make life very difficult for people who cross him. Let him try." Judah reached across the table, covered her hand with his. Her skin was warm, calloused from honest work, and he felt something inside him settle into place like a key finding its lock. "I've been alone in this house for 15 years, Rowan. 15 years of eating supper by myself, of talking to horses because there wasn't another soul to listen. You've been here less than a week, and already I can't imagine it without you." Her eyes filled with tears. She tried to blink away. "You barely know me." "I know enough." And he did. He knew she made coffee strong enough to wake the dead and biscuits that would make angels weep. He knew she hummed when she worked and had gentle hands with injured animals. He knew she'd rather go hungry than take more than her share, and that she'd stayed married to a brutal man because she'd made a promise and meant to keep it. What if he comes with the law? What if he claims I stole from him? "Did you?" "No, but that won't matter if he says I did." Judah stood up, walked to the old pine cabinet in the corner, and pulled out a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for some occasion that had never come. He poured 2 glasses, set one in front of her. "My grandfather built this ranch with nothing but a strong back and a stubborn streak. My father expanded it through droughts and hard winters and cattle rustlers who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. And I've held it together through grief that should have killed me and loneliness that nearly did." He raised his glass. "I've never backed down from a fight that mattered, and I'm not starting now." She stared at him, as if he was speaking a foreign language. "Why would you do this for me?" The question hung between them, loaded with all the weight of what he was offering and what it might cost them both. Judah looked at this woman who'd stumbled into his life like grace in a storm, who'd brought light to corners of his heart he'd thought were dead forever. "Because," he said simply, "some things are worth fighting for." She picked up her glass with trembling fingers, clinked it against his. The whiskey burned going down, but it was nothing compared to the fire he saw kindling in her eyes, hope and determination, and something that might have been love if they'd had more time to let it grow. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows like a warning. Somewhere out there, Marcus Whitmore was probably already looking for his missing wife, following tracks that would eventually lead him here. But inside this kitchen, in the golden light of afternoon, Judah Cain made a promise that would change everything. He was done running from life, and he wasn't about to let anyone take away what he'd finally found worth living for. The leatherwork gloves had belonged to 3 generations of Cain men, passed down like a sacred trust from grandfather to father to son. They lay on the kitchen table between Judah and Rowan, worn smooth by decades of honest labor, the fingertips darkened with oil and time. His grandfather's hands had broken this land, his father's had built it up, and his own had held it together through the worst years of his life. "These were made to last," he said, picking up one glove and running his thumb along the careful stitching. "My grandfather always said a man's tools were only as good as the hands that used them, but good tools made any job easier." Rowan reached out tentatively, touching the supple leather. "They're beautiful. You can see the love in every stitch." Something about the way she said it, with genuine reverence for the craftsmanship, made him look at her more closely. She understood what these gloves represented, not just protection for working hands, but legacy, continuity, the idea that some things were built to outlast the men who made them. "I want to teach you," he heard himself say. "Ranch work, I mean, proper ranch work." She looked up, surprised. "I thought I was already helping." "You are, But there's more to running a place like this than cooking and cleaning. He gestured toward the window, where morning light was painting the snow-covered pastures gold. Cattle need to be checked, fences mended, equipment maintained. It's a lot for one person. What he didn't say was that watching her these past days had shown him something he'd forgotten: the satisfaction of sharing work with someone who understood its value. She didn't complain about early mornings or cold weather, didn't treat ranch tasks like drudgery to be endured. When she gathered eggs, she moved with the same careful attention she brought to everything else, and when she helped him carry feed to the cattle, she paid attention to which animals looked healthy and which might need watching. "I'd like that," she said quietly. "I've never really learned to do anything useful." "That husband of yours never taught you anything?" Her face darkened. Marcus believed wives should be decorative. He hired people to do the actual work. The more Judah learned about Marcus Whitmore, the less he liked him. What kind of man kept a woman like a pretty ornament, never letting her discover what she was capable of? It was waste, pure and simple, like keeping a good horse locked in a stall instead of letting it run. "Well," he said, standing up and pulling on his coat, "that changes today. Get your things on. We're going to start with the horses." The barn was warm and dim, filled with the sweet smell of hay and the comfortable sounds of animals at rest. Judah's horses were good, stock-sturdy quarter horses, bred for ranch work, with the kind of steady temperaments that made them reliable partners in any weather. "This is Belle," he said, stopping at the first stall. The mare was a deep brown with white markings on her face and feet, gentle enough for a child but strong enough to work cattle all day. "She's getting on in years, but she's got more sense than most people I know." Rowan extended her hand carefully, letting the horse sniff her fingers before touching the velvet muzzle. Belle nuzzled her palm, looking for treats, and Rowan laughed, the first real laugh Judah had heard from her. "She likes you," he observed. "Animals are good judges of character." "I've always loved horses," Rowan admitted, "but I never got to be around them much." Another mark against Marcus Whitmore. Judah pulled Belle's halter from its peg and slipped it over the mare's head. "Today, you're going to learn to handle her properly. Can't run a ranch if you can't work with the horses." He spent the morning teaching her the basic show, to approach a horse safely, how to read their body language, how to clean hooves and check for injuries. Rowan was a quick study, her movements becoming more confident as she learned to trust her instincts around the animals. "You're a natural," he said, watching her brush Belle's coat with long, smooth strokes. "Most people are either afraid of horses or try to dominate them. You understand it's about partnership." She paused in her brushing, looking at him over the horse's back. "Is that what this is? Partnership?" The question caught him off guard, loaded with meaning that went beyond horse handling. He met her eyes across Belle's withers, seeing the uncertainty there, the hope she was trying not to show. "I reckon it could be," he said carefully, "if that's what you want." "I want to learn everything," she said, with sudden intensity. "I want to be useful, to contribute something real. I'm tired of being helpless." The rest of the day passed in a blur of lessons. He taught her to read the weather signs in the behavior of the cattle, showed her how to spot the early signs of sickness or injury in the herd. She absorbed every detail with the focus of someone making up for lost time, asking intelligent questions that showed she was thinking beyond the immediate task to the larger picture of ranch management. When they came in for lunch, she moved with new confidence, her shoulders straighter, her step more purposeful. The work had awakened something in her, and Judah found himself remembering what it had been like to discover his own capabilities. The satisfaction of mastering skills that connected him to the land and the animals in his care. "I never knew I could do things like this," she said, over their simple meal of bread and soup. "Marcus always said I was too delicate for real work." Marcus was a fool. The words came out harder than he'd intended, but he didn't take them back. "You've got good hands and a steady head. That's more than half the battle right there." That afternoon, he put the worn gloves on her hands, watching as she tried to hide her emotions at the gesture. They were too big, but she wore them with the same reverence she'd shown when she first touched them. "These gloves have seen a lot of work," he said as they walked toward the cattle pen. My grandfather wore them when he built the first fence on this property. My father wore them when he expanded the herd. I wore them when—" He stopped, throat tightening unexpectedly. "When what?" she asked gently. "When I buried my wife," he finished quietly. "When I thought my life was over and all I had left was the work." She was quiet for a long moment, understanding instinctively that this was more than just lending her tools for the job. This was acceptance, belonging, the promise that she had a place here if she wanted it. "I'll take good care of them," she said simply. "I know you will." As they worked together that day, checking fences and moving cattle, Judah watched the way she handled herself with the animals, the careful attention she paid to his instructions, the satisfaction that lit her face when she mastered a new skill. For the first time in 15 years, he wasn't working alone, and the difference was like the sun coming out after a long, dark winter. When evening came and they walked back to the house together, the gloves still on her hands, Judah realized something had shifted between them. They weren't just two people thrown together by circumstance anymore. They were becoming partners, building something together that neither of them could create alone. The thought should have scared him. Instead, it felt like coming home. Rowan found the comb while cleaning the upstairs bedroom that had once belonged to Judah's parents. It was tucked away in the back of a drawer, wrapped in faded tissue paper, the wood worn smooth as silk from years of gentle use. Even before she unwrapped it completely, she knew what it was too delicate for a man's hands, carved with tiny flowers along the spine, made with the kind of patient love that took months to complete. She sat on the edge of the bed, turning the comb over in her hands, tracing the intricate pattern with her fingertip. Each flower was perfect, no bigger than her thumbnail, carved with such detail she could make out individual petals and leaves. This was the work of a man who understood that the smallest gestures often carried the deepest meaning. I wondered where that had gotten to. She looked up to find Judah standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Heat flooded her cheeks at being caught going through his private things, and she started to wrap the comb back up. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I was just cleaning, and I found it in the drawer. I didn't mean to pry." "It's all right." He stepped into the room, and she noticed the way his eyes went to the comb in her hands. "I made that for Sarah. Took me the better part of winter, working on it in the evenings." The simple words carried a weight of memory that made her chest tight. She could picture him hunched over his workbench, carefully shaping each tiny flower, thinking about the woman who would wear his gift in her hair. The kind of intimate, patient love she'd never known existed until she'd come to this house. "It's beautiful," she whispered. She must have treasured it. She did. His voice was soft, distant. Used it every morning when she braided her hair. Said it made her feel like a queen. Rowan started to hand it back to him, but he shook his head. "Keep it," he said. "Use it. That's what it was made for." She stared at him, the comb warm in her palms. "I can't. This belongs to your wife." "My wife is dead, Rowan." The words weren't harsh, just matter-of-fact, carrying the weight of 15 years' acceptance. "The comb isn't doing anybody any good wrapped up in tissue paper. Sarah would have wanted it to be useful again." There was something in his eyes that made her breath catch not just permission, but invitation. A bridge offered across the careful distance they'd both been maintaining. She thought about all the mornings she'd struggled to braid her long hair with nothing but her fingers, all the time she'd caught him watching her work it into a simple knot at the base of her neck. "Are you sure?" she asked. Instead of answering, he crossed to the small mirror hanging above the dresser and gestured for her to join him. She rose slowly, comb still clutched in her hands, and stood beside him in front of the glass. Her reflection looked back at her plain brown hair escaping from its hasty braid, face still too thin from years of not eating enough, wearing one of his mother's old dresses that she'd taken in to fit. "Your hair's beautiful," he said quietly, reaching up to touch a strand that had worked loose, shame to hide it away all the time. His fingers brushed her neck as he tucked the hair behind her ear, and she felt heat spiral through her that had nothing to do with embarrassment. When was the last time someone had touched her with such gentleness? When had anyone ever called her beautiful and meant it? I don't know. Fancy styles, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Don't need to be fancy. His hands moved to her shoulders, steadying her, and she could see both their faces in the mirror, his tall and weathered behind her, smaller, darker one. Just needs to be you. She loosened her braid with trembling fingers, letting her hair fall in dark waves past her shoulders. It had grown long during her marriage. Another of Marcus's rules: she'd liked her hair long but always pinned up, never loose where other men might see it and get ideas. Now, watching Judah's face in the mirror as her hair spilled free, she saw something that made her pulse quicken. The comb slid through her hair like it was made for the task, gathering the thick strands into a simple twist that she secured with pins from the dresser. Not fancy, like he'd said, but neat and pretty, with a few tendrils left free to soften her face. "There," he said, his voice rough around the edges. "Perfect." She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. With her hair done up and the borrowed dress fitted properly, she looked almost not beautiful, exactly, but worthy of being looked at. Worthy of gentle touches and carved combs, and the kind of quiet admiration she could see in Judah's reflection. "Thank you," she said, turning to face him. "For the comb, for everything." They were standing close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could smell the clean scent of soap and leather, and something that was purely him. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her. The possibility hung in the air between them like morning mist, full of promise and uncertainty. Instead, he stepped back, running a hand through his own hair. "I should let you finish your cleaning," he said, but his eyes lingered on her face, on the way the comb caught the afternoon light streaming through the window. After he left, Rowan sat back down on the bed, touching the comb in her hair with careful fingers. It felt strange to wear something so precious, something that carried another woman's history. But it also felt right, like accepting a blessing passed down from one woman to another. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Judah reading the week-old newspaper and she mending a tear in one of his shirts, she caught him glancing at her hair. Each time their eyes met, he'd look away quickly, but not before she saw the appreciation there, the way a man looked at a woman he was beginning to care for. She thought about Sarah, the girl who had worn this comb and loved this man and filled this house with laughter for 18 precious months. Had she sat in this same chair, mending his clothes while he read beside her? Had she felt this same quiet contentment, this sense of belonging that was growing stronger every day? "Judah," she said softly, setting down her sewing. "Hmm? Tell me about her. About Sarah." He looked up from his paper, surprise flickering across his face. Most women, she knew, wouldn't want to hear about their predecessor. But Rowan found herself genuinely curious about the woman who had claimed this man's heart so completely that he'd carried her memory for 15 years. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," she said simply. "What she was like, what made her laugh, how you met." And so he told her, his voice soft in the firelight, about the girl with honey-colored hair who had stolen his heart at a church social and married him 3 months later. About her laugh that could charm birds from trees and her cooking that was terrible but enthusiastic. About the fever that took her so quickly there was no time for goodbyes, leaving him with nothing but memories and a carved comb wrapped in tissue paper. When he finished, they sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them. Rowan touched the comb again, understanding now that wearing it wasn't about replacing Sarah or pretending she had never existed. It was about honoring what came before while making space for what might come next. "She sounds wonderful," Rowan said finally. She was. Judah folded his paper, set it aside. "But that was a long time ago, and I'm learning that a man's heart might be bigger than he thought." The words hung between them, full of possibility and careful hope. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them both that winter wasn't over yet. But inside, by the fire, something new was beginning to bloom. The quilt lay folded in the cedar chest at the foot of Judah's bed, hidden beneath his mother's wedding dress and his father's good suit. Rowan discovered it by accident while looking for extra blankets during a particularly cold snap, her hands finding the familiar weight of pieced cotton and careful stitching. She lifted it out slowly, her breath catching as the pattern revealed itself in the lamplight. It was a wedding ring design, each interlocking circle made from scraps of fabric in soft blues and creams, and palest yellow, the colors of a Montana spring sky. But half the rings were empty, their borders sewn but their centers blank, as if the maker had simply stopped in the middle of her work and never found the heart to continue. "That was going to be our wedding quilt," Judah said from the doorway, and Rowan turned to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Sarah started it the week after we married, said every good wife needed to make her husband a proper quilt." Rowan's fingers traced the unfinished edges, imagining the young bride who had chosen these fabrics with such care, who had planned to fill every ring with love and patience and dreams of the future. Why didn't she finish it? Ran out of time. His voice was matter-of-fact, but she could hear the old pain underneath. The fever came fast. One day she was complaining about her stitches being crooked. The next, she was burning up with sickness. She looked at the empty rings, seeing them now for what they were, not just unfinished work, but interrupted hopes, a life cut short before it could fully bloom. The sadness of it made her chest tight. "I should put it back," she said, starting to refold the quilt. "No." Judah stepped into the room, his movements careful and deliberate. "I want you to have it. To finish it, I mean. If you want to." She stared at him, the half-finished quilt heavy in her arms. "I couldn't. This is hers, sacred to her memory." "Rowan." He moved closer, close enough that she could see the earnestness in his eyes. "Sarah would have wanted it finished. She was practical that way, never could stand to see good work go to waste. And—" He paused, running a hand through his hair in the gesture she'd learned meant he was struggling with words. "And maybe it's time this house had some new memories alongside the old ones." The permission in his voice was clear, but so was something else, kind of blessing, as if he were entrusting her not just with Sarah's needlework, but with the future of this home. This life they were building together, thread by careful thread. "I don't know the pattern," she said weakly. "I can show you. My mother taught me to quilt when I was laid up with a broken leg one winter, said a man should know useful skills, not just the ones that involved horses and cattle." So began their evening ritual. After supper and chores were done, they would sit by the fire with the quilt stretched between them, Judah's large hands surprisingly gentle as he guided her through the intricate piecing. She learned to match points and ease curves, to make her stitches small and even, to choose fabrics that would complement rather than compete. "The secret," he told her one night as they worked on a particularly tricky intersection, "is patience. Can't rush a quilt any more than you can rush a good horse or a garden. Everything has its own time." She thought about that as she worked, about the way patience had become a luxury in her previous life. Marcus had demanded everything immediately, meals served, the moment he was hungry, clothes mended the instant. He noticed a tear, her attention focused entirely on his needs, without delay or distraction. The idea that something could be made slowly, carefully, with love as the only deadline, was as foreign as speaking a different language. But here, in the golden circle of lamplight with Judah's quiet presence beside her, she began to understand what he meant. Each stitch was a small meditation, each completed ring, a small victory. The rhythm of needle through fabric became as soothing as prayer, and gradually the empty spaces began to fill with her own hopes and dreams, alongside Sarah's interrupted ones. "You're getting good at this," Judah observed one evening, watching her set a difficult curve with practiced ease. "Your stitches are smaller than mine now." "I like the work," she admitted. "I like making something beautiful that will last." He was quiet for a moment, his needle pausing in its steady rhythm. "Is that what you want? To last?" The question hung between them, loaded with meaning that went far beyond quilting. She looked up from her work to find him watching her with an intensity that made her heart skip. "Here, you mean," she asked softly. Here, with me, building something that might outlast us both. She set down her needle, the fabric pooling in her lap, as she considered his words. In the weeks since the storm had brought her to his door, she had felt herself changing, growing stronger and more confident under his patient guidance. The frightened woman who had collapsed in his yard was being replaced by someone who could gentle a spooked horse, who could read the weather in the behavior of cattle, who could take pride in the straightness of her stitches and the beauty of her finished work. I want to be worthy of lasting, she said finally. I want to be someone you could build a life with, not just someone you rescued from the cold. Rowan, his voice was rough with emotion. You think I don't see what you've become? What you've always been, underneath all that fear and doubt? You're the strongest woman I know. I don't feel strong. Strength isn't about feeling it, he said, setting down his own needle and reaching for her hands. It's about getting up every morning and doing what needs to be done, even when you're scared. It's about learning new things and trying again when you fail. It's about having the courage to hope for better when everything in your past tells you to expect worse. His thumbs traced gentle circles on her palms, and she felt the familiar heat that always sparked when he touched her. But this was different, not just attraction, but recognition. The acknowledgement that what they were building together was more than convenience or loneliness or even desire. The quilt's almost finished, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I know. What happens then? Then we start the next one, he said simply, and the one after that, however many it takes to fill this house with beauty. She looked down at the quilt in her lap, at the intricate pattern of interlocking rings that seemed to go on forever, each one connected to the next in an unbroken chain of love and hope and patient labor. Sarah's work and her own, two women's dreams woven together into something neither could have created alone. I'd like that, she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. When they went to bed that night, the quilt carefully folded and set aside for the next evening's work, Rowan felt something settle deep in her chest. For the first time since childhood, she was building something that belonged to her, something that would last beyond the whims of angry men and the fear that had ruled her life for so long. In her dreams, she saw the finished quilt spread across a marriage bed, saw children's hands tracing the careful stitches while she told them stories of the two women who had made Itone, who had loved and lost, and one who had found love when she thought it was impossible. When she woke, the dream felt less like wishful thinking and more like prophecy. Rowan wrote the letter on a Tuesday morning while Judah was checking the north pasture, her hands trembling as she formed each careful word on paper torn from his ledger book. She had started and discarded 3 versions already, unable to find the right way to explain what her life had become, how she had found safety and purpose, and something that might be love in the most unlikely place. Dear Mary, she wrote, I hope this letter finds you well, and that Robert is recovered from his winter cough. I know it has been months since you last heard from me, and I fear you must think the worst. The truth is both simpler and more complicated than you might imagine. She paused, chewing the end of the pen, trying to decide how much to reveal. Mary was her younger sister, the only family she had left, married to a decent man who farmed a small plot outside Billings. They had offered her shelter when Marcus's cruelty had become impossible to hide, but Rowan had been too proud to accept, too convinced that she could somehow fix her marriage through patience and submission. I have left Marcus, she continued, the words flowing easier now. I know you warned me about him from the beginning, and I should have listened. You were right about his temper, about the way he saw women as possessions rather than partners. I stayed too long, made too many excuses, but I finally found the courage to leave. She described the storm, the collapse at Judah's door, the way he had taken her in without questions or conditions. But when she tried to explain what had grown between them, the quiet mornings working side by side, the evenings by the fire with Sarah's quilt stretched between them, the way he looked at her as if she were precious rather than burdensome, words seemed inadequate. He is nothing like Marcus, she wrote finally. He is patient and kind, and he sees strength in me that I never knew I possessed. For the first time in my life, I feel like I am becoming the person I was meant to be. But even as she wrote the words, doubt crept in around the edges. What if this was all temporary? What if Judah's kindness came from loneliness rather than genuine affection? What if she was simply a convenient replacement for the wife he had lost? Someone to fill the empty spaces in his house and his bed until something better came along. The letter remained unfinished on the kitchen table when Judah returned, dirt on his boots and satisfaction in his expression. Spring was coming early this year, and the signs were everywhere: longer days, patches of bare ground showing through the snow, the restless energy of cattle eager for fresh grass. "Calving season's going to start soon," he said, hanging his coat on its peg. "Probably within the week. You ready for some sleepless nights?" She had been dreading and anticipating this in equal measure. Calving season was the most critical time on a ranch, when months of careful planning either paid off or fell apart. Judah had been teaching her to recognize the signs of difficult births, how to assist when necessary, when to call for help. It would be her first real test as a ranch partner. "As ready as I can be," she said, folding the letter quickly and slipping it into her apron pocket. "Will you be staying in the barn?" "Some nights, probably. The heifers especially, they're the ones most likely to have trouble." He noticed the paper and pen on the table, the ink still wet where she had been writing. "Letter? To my sister," she said, heat rising in her cheeks. "I haven't written to her since I left Marcus. She's probably worried." Something shifted in his expression, a tightening around his eyes that she had learned to recognize. "You telling her where you are?" The careful neutrality in his voice made her stomach clench. Of course, he would worry about her revealing their location, about word getting back to Marcus through well-meaning family members. She had been so focused on her own need to reach out that she hadn't considered the risk to him. "I hadn't decided," she said honestly. "Part of me wants her to know I'm safe, but part of me is afraid." "Afraid of what?" She looked at him standing there in his work clothes, solid and dependable as the mountains outside their windows, and felt her throat tighten with emotions she couldn't name. "Afraid this isn't real," she whispered. "Afraid it's too good to last. Afraid that if I write it down, if I claim it out loud, something will happen to take it away." The understanding that crossed his face was so tender it made her eyes burn. He crossed to her in 3 long strides, his hands coming up to frame her face with the same gentleness he used with newborn calves. "Rowan," he said softly, "this is real. What we're building here, what we've found together, it's as real as anything I've ever known. But what if Marcus comes? What if he has legal claims I don't understand? What if the sky falls down?" He interrupted gently. "What if the creek runs dry? What if the cattle all grow wings and fly away? You can't live your life preparing for every possible disaster." She leaned into his touch, drawing strength from his steadiness. "It's hard to believe in good things when you've had so few of them." "I know." His thumbs brushed away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "But you're not the same woman who collapsed in my yard 2 months ago. You're stronger now, more sure of yourself, and you're not alone anymore." She nodded, trying to absorb his certainty, to make it her own. "What should I do about the letter?" "Write it," he said firmly. "Tell your sister you're happy. Tell her you've found a good man who treats you the way you deserve to be treated. Tell her—" He paused, his eyes searching her face. "Tell her you're thinking about staying permanently, if that's what you want." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Not just staying through the winter or until the danger passed, but staying. Building a life together, maybe even making it legal someday if things continued as they were going. "Is that what you want?" she asked, hardly daring to breathe. "I want whatever makes you happy," he said simply. "But if I'm being honest, I can't imagine this place without you anymore. Can't imagine going back to eating supper alone or talking to the horses because there's nobody else to listen." She reached up to cover his hands with hers, pressing them more firmly against her cheeks. "Then that's what I'll tell her, that I'm happy, that I'm home." But even as she said the words, even as she saw the relief and joy that flooded his expression, she kept the letter in her pocket. Some superstitious part of her, insisted that writing down her happiness would somehow jinx it, that claiming her contentment too boldly would invite the attention of whatever cruel gods had ruled her life before. That night, she tucked the unfinished letter into the pages of Sarah's Bible, alongside pressed flowers and faded ribbons and all the other small treasures of a life well lived. Someday, when she was truly sure that this blessing wouldn't be snatched away, she would finish it and send it off into the world. But for now, it was enough to know that she had something worth writing about at all. The sheriff's badge caught the morning sun as Deputy Marshal Jim Thornton dismounted from his horse, the metal star gleaming like a warning against his dark coat. Rowan saw him first through the kitchen window, her hands stilling on the bread dough she was kneading as ice-cold recognition shot through her veins. "Judah!" she called, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "Someone's coming." He appeared in the kitchen doorway, took one look at her face, and moved immediately to the window. His jaw tightened as he took in the official uniform, the purposeful way the man approached their door. "Stay behind me," he said quietly, but Rowan was already untying her apron, her mind racing through possibilities. Had Marcus finally tracked her down? Was this the moment she had been dreading, when her temporary sanctuary would be stripped away by law and legal documents she couldn't fight? The knock came firm and authoritative. Judah opened the door with Rowan just behind his shoulder, close enough to see the telegram folded in the deputy's hand, like a weapon waiting to be deployed. "Morning, folks," Thornton said, touching the brim of his hat. "I'm looking for a woman named Rowan Whitmore. I'm told she might be staying here." "Might be," Judah replied evenly. "Depends who's asking and why." The deputy's eyes found Rowan over Judah's shoulder, and she saw recognition there, along with something that might have been sympathy. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm Deputy Marshal Thornton from Helena. I have a legal document here from your husband requesting your immediate return." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Rowan gripped the doorframe, fighting the urge to run, to grab what few possessions she had, and flee into the mountains where Marcus's reach couldn't follow. But Judah's solid presence beside her kept her rooted, and she found her voice. "I'm not his wife anymore," she said, surprised by how steady the words came out. "I left him. I have no intention of returning." "Well now, ma'am, that's not exactly how the law sees it." Thornton's voice held genuine regret as he unfolded the telegram. "According to this here document, you're still legally married to Marcus Whitmore, and he's got rights as your husband. Says here you took some valuable property when you left, and he wants it back." "Property?" Rowan's voice cracked on the word. "What property?" "Jewelry, he claims. Family heirlooms worth considerable money. He's got witnesses who say you took them when you ran off." The lie hit her like a physical blow. She had taken nothing from Marcus's house, except the clothes on her back had, owned nothing of value that wasn't given to her at his whim, and subject to being taken away when his mood shifted. But she could see how it would play out in court, her word against his, a respected businessman with connections against a woman who had fled in the night. "That's not true," she said desperately. "I never took anything. I had nothing to take." "Be that as it may," Thornton said, clearly uncomfortable with his role. "I've got legal papers here saying otherwise, and I've got orders to escort you back to Helena for questioning." "Like hell you do." Judah's voice was quiet, but carried the unmistakable edge of a man pushed too far. "This is my property, Deputy, and she's under my protection. You want to take her anywhere, you better have more than some rich man's word on a piece of paper." Thornton's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, then stopped as he took in Judah's stance, the coiled readiness that spoke of a man who wouldn't go down easy. "Now, Mr. Cain, I don't want any trouble here. I'm just doing my job." "Your job is to uphold justice, not to drag innocent women back to men who beat them." Judah stepped forward, and Rowan saw something in his face she had never seen before, a cold, controlled fury that made him look dangerous. "You see any jewelry around here, Deputy? Any family heirlooms? Or do you just see a woman who's finally found some peace after years of hell?" The deputy's eyes swept the simple kitchen, taking in the worn furniture and mended curtains, the clear evidence of honest poverty. Whatever he had expected to find, it wasn't this humble ranch house with its atmosphere of quiet contentment. "Mr. Whitmore says she's cunning," he said weakly. "Says she probably hid whatever she took." "Mr. Whitmore says a lot of things," Judah replied. "Question is, are you going to believe a man who sells his wife to pay gambling debts, or are you going to use your own eyes and see what's really going on here?" Thornton's expression shifted, surprise replacing official determination. "He sold his wife?" "To another man for gambling debts," Rowan said, finding her courage again. "That's why I ran. Not for jewelry or money or anything else he claims I took. I ran because he treated me like property to be disposed of when I became inconvenient." The deputy looked between them, clearly struggling with conflicting stories and his own sense of right and wrong. "That's a serious accusation, ma'am." "It's the truth," she said simply, "and I can prove it. The man he sold me to, Owen Baker, he'll verify the story if you ask him. He's the one who told me to run, who gave me enough money to get away." Thornton absorbed this information, his official resolve clearly wavering, but he still held the telegram, still had his orders, and Rowan could see the struggle playing out across his face. "I still got to follow the law," he said finally. "And the law says a wife belongs with her husband until a court says otherwise." "Then we'll go to court," Judah said firmly. "Get a proper judge to hear both sides instead of railroading her back to a man who's already tried to sell her once. Mr. Cain, I appreciate your concern for the lady, but this is family business." "She's my family now." The words came out with such quiet conviction that even Rowan stared at him in surprise. "We're planning to be married as soon as her situation gets sorted out, legal-like. That makes her my concern and my responsibility." The deputy's eyebrows rose. "That's so, ma'am." Rowan looked at Judah, seeing the challenge in his eyes, the unspoken question. This was her chance to claim a different future, to step fully into the life they had been building together. Or she could let fear win, let Marcus's threats and legal maneuvering drag her back into the darkness she had escaped. "Yes," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Mr. Cain has asked me to marry him, and I've accepted. We were waiting for my legal situation to be resolved before making it official." It wasn't entirely true. They had never spoken of marriage directly, only danced around the possibility in careful conversations and shared glances. But as she said the words, she realized they felt more real than anything else in her life. This was where she belonged, with this man who had shown her what love could look like when it wasn't twisted by cruelty and control. Thornton looked between them again, clearly out of his depth. A missing wife was one thing, but a woman claiming abuse and seeking to remarry was another matter entirely, especially when her current protector looked capable of making serious trouble if pushed too far. "This is getting complicated," he said finally. "I think I need to wire Helena for instructions." "You do that," Judah said. "But until you get different orders, she stays here, under my protection." The deputy nodded reluctantly, clearly relieved to have a reason to delay. "I'll be back," he warned. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." After he rode away, Rowan and Judah stood in the kitchen doorway, watching the dust settle from his horse's hooves. The morning that had started so peacefully now felt charged with danger, and Rowan could feel her carefully built sense of security crumbling around the edges. "Did you mean it?" she asked quietly. "About marriage?" Judah turned to face her, his expression serious but gentle. "I meant every word. Question is, did you?" She thought about the life she had found here, the woman she had become under his patient guidance. She thought about the half-finished quilt upstairs, the letters she wrote but didn't send, the way he looked at her as if she were precious beyond measure. "Yes," she said simply. "I meant it too." He pulled her into his arms then, holding her tight against his chest, while the reality of what they faced settled around them like storm clouds. Marcus was coming, armed with law and money and the kind of connections that could make their lives very difficult. But they would face it together, and somehow that made all the difference. That evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Judah climbed the stairs to his bedroom with heavy steps. The day had been a whirlwind of preparation and planning, of sending word to neighbors who might stand with them and checking supplies in case they needed to hold out against whatever Marcus Whitmore brought to their door. But now, in the quiet of approaching night, he needed to make peace with the past before he could fully commit to fighting for the future. Sarah's Bible lay where it always had, on the small table beside his bed, its leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. He opened it carefully, breathing in the faint scent of pressed flowers and old paper, and there, between the pages of Ecclesiastes, found what he was looking for: a single wildflower, purple as summer twilight, flattened and preserved like a prayer made tangible. She had picked it on their wedding day, he remembered, plucked it from the grass outside the little church where they had spoken their vows. For remembering, she had said with that bright smile that had stolen his heart. So when we're old and grey, we'll have something to remind us of how perfect this day was. They had never gotten the chance to be old and grey together. The fever had taken her before they could even reach their second anniversary, leaving him with nothing but memories and a pressed flower that had somehow survived when everything else turned to dust. He sat on the edge of the bed, turning the delicate bloom between his fingers, and for the first time in 15 years, he spoke to his dead wife out loud. "I love her, Sarah," he said quietly. "I love Rowan in a way I thought I'd never love again. It's different from what we had, quieter, maybe deeper in some ways, because I know now how precious it is. But it's real, and it's strong, and I hope you'd approve." The flower seemed to shimmer in the lamplight, its purple petals translucent as stained glass. He had kept it all these years as a talisman against forgetting, terrified that moving forward meant somehow betraying the memory of what they had shared. But sitting here now, with Rowan's laughter still echoing from the kitchen below and the scent of her cooking filling his house, he realized that love wasn't a finite resource to be hoarded and guarded. "She makes me better," he continued, his voice growing stronger, "makes me remember that I'm more than just grief and loneliness, and I hope I do the same for her. She's been hurt, Sarah. Hurt bad by a man who should have treasured her, but she's strong, stronger than she knows, and she deserves someone who'll fight for her." A gentle breeze stirred through the open window, carrying the sounds of cattle settling for the night and the distant call of a nighthawk. It felt like an answer, like benediction, and something that had been knotted tight in his chest for 15 years finally began to loosen. He placed the flower carefully back in its place between the pages, but this time the gesture felt different, not like preserving something dead, but like honoring something that had been and given its blessing to what might be. Sarah's love had made him the man he was, had taught him what it meant to cherish another soul completely. Without that foundation, he never could have recognized the gift that Rowan represented, never could have opened his heart to the possibility of healing. "Thank you," he whispered to the photograph on his dresser, to the memory of honey-colored hair and bright laughter. "For loving me first, for teaching me how, and for letting me love again." The next morning brought news that set the entire valley buzzing with gossip and speculation. Deputy Thornton returned with a larger escort and official papers demanding Rowan's return to Helena for questioning. But he also brought something else: stories of Marcus Whitmore's growing desperation, of debts mounting and creditors closing in, of a man whose respectable facade was beginning to crack under pressure. "Word around Helena is that he's in deep with some dangerous people," Thornton confided quietly while his men watered their horses. "Gambling debts mostly, but also some business dealings that don't bear close scrutiny. Could be he needs his wife back for more than just principle." The implications were clear. If Marcus was in financial trouble, Rowan's return might be about more than saving face or reclaiming property. She might be intended as payment again, sold to whoever held Marcus's debts, her freedom bartered away to buy her husband's safety. "Over my dead body," Judah said quietly, and something in his voice made the deputy step back. "Now, Mr. Cain, I understand your feelings, but the law is the law." "The law protects people from being sold like cattle," Judah interrupted. "At least, it should. And if it doesn't, then maybe it's time for decent folks to make their own law." By afternoon, those decent folks began arriving. Tom Morrison from the next ranch over, bringing his 2 grown sons and a grim determination to see justice done. Martha Henley from town, carrying a basket of food and a Winchester rifle she handled like she knew how to use it. Old Pete Garrison, who had known Judah's father and wasn't about to see the son bullied by some city slicker with more money than morals. "We heard you might need some extra hands," Tom said simply, settling his horse beside the porch where Judah waited. "Figured we'd better come see what we could do." More kept coming as word spread. Neighbors, who had watched Judah struggle through 15 years of loneliness, who had seen the change in him since Rowan's arrival, who understood that some fights were bigger than the people directly involved. By evening, nearly 20 men and women had gathered at the Cain ranch, armed and determined and ready to stand against whatever Marcus Whitmore might bring. "This is about more than just one woman," Martha declared as they gathered around the kitchen table to plan their strategy. "This is about whether decent people get to live their lives in peace or whether money and connections can trample anybody who gets in the way." Rowan moved among them like a ghost, bringing coffee and food, listening to their quiet conversations with something like wonder in her eyes. She had never seen people rally to defend someone like her, someone with no money or influence, no family connections or social standing. The idea that virtual strangers would risk their own safety for her freedom seemed to shake her understanding of how the world worked. "I can't ask you to do this," she said to Judah as they stood together on the porch, watching the men check their weapons and the women organize supplies. "If someone gets hurt because of me—" "Nobody's getting hurt," he said firmly. "But if they do, it won't be because of you. It'll be because Marcus Whitmore decided that people are property to be bought and sold, and good folks decided to prove him wrong." She leaned against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I know. So am I." He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. "But fear doesn't mean we stop fighting. It just means what we're fighting for matters enough to be afraid of losing it." As night fell and their defenders settled in for what might be a long wait, Judah and Rowan sat by the fire, with Sarah's completed quilt spread across their laps. The last ring had been finished that afternoon, filled with fabric from one of Rowan's old dresses, the only piece of her former life worth preserving, transformed now into something beautiful and lasting. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Rowan said quietly, her fingers tracing the intricate pattern, "I want you to know that these past months have been the happiest of my life. You gave me back myself, Judah. You showed me I was worth more than I ever believed." "You did the same for me," he replied, covering her hand with his. "I was just existing before you came, going through the motions of living without really being alive. You changed all that." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the murmur of voices from the other room where their friends kept watch, feeling the weight of the moment, settling around them like a benediction. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, but tonight they were together, surrounded by people who cared about them, wrapped in a quilt that represented the blending of past and present into something entirely new. "I love you," Rowan said suddenly, the words coming out in a rush, as if she needed to speak them before she lost her nerve. "I know we've been careful about saying it, but I need you to know. Whatever happens, I love you." "I love you too," he replied without hesitation. "More than I thought it was possible to love again. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving it to you, no matter what Marcus Whitmore or anyone else tries to do about it." Outside, a horse whinnied softly, and one of the men called out a quiet challenge to someone approaching in the darkness. But inside, by the fire, 2 people who had found each other against all odds held tight to what they had built together, ready to defend it with everything they had. The battle for their future was about to begin. Marcus Whitmore arrived with the dawn, his carriage flanked by 6 armed men whose hard faces and easy familiarity with violence marked them as more than simple ranch hands. They came up the valley road in a cloud of dust and menace, the morning sun glinting off rifle barrels and the silver trim on Marcus's expensive coat. Judah stood on his porch with his grandfather's Colt revolver heavy on his hip, the weight of it familiar as his own heartbeat. The gun was older than he was, carried through Indian wars and cattle drives by men who understood that some things were worth dying for. Today, it might serve that purpose again. "That's far enough," he called out when the carriage was still 50 yards from the house. His voice carried clearly in the crisp morning air, backed by the authority of a man defending his own ground. Marcus stepped down from his carriage with theatrical precision, adjusting his coat and smoothing his dark hair as if this were a social call rather than a confrontation. He was a handsome man in his 40s, well-dressed and soft around the middle, with the kind of smooth confidence that came from never having his authority seriously challenged. "Mr. Cain," he said pleasantly, his cultured voice carrying a hint of Eastern refinement, "I believe you have something that belongs to me." "I don't see anything here that belongs to you," Judah replied evenly. "This is my land, my house, my choice who stays and who goes." "My wife would disagree." Marcus's smile was sharp as a blade. "Rowan, darling, come out here and tell this gentleman you're ready to come home." The porch door opened, and Rowan stepped out to stand beside Judah, her chin raised in quiet defiance despite the fear he could see trembling in her hands. She had dressed carefully for this confrontation, wearing her best dress with her hair pinned up, using Sarah's carved comb, looking every inch the respectable woman she had become. "I'm not your wife anymore, Marcus," she said, her voice steady. "I left you, and I'm not coming back." Marcus's pleasant expression flickered, revealing something darker underneath. "You're confused, my dear. Perhaps this rustic life has addled your thinking. You made promises before God, and witnesses promises that can't be broken by running away like a spoiled child. Promises you broke first." Rowan shot back, fire kindling in her eyes. "When you raised your hand to me, when you sold me to Owen Baker like a broodmare, when you treated me like property instead of a person." "Lies," Marcus said dismissively, but Judah caught the quick glance he shot toward his men, gauging their reaction to these accusations. "You always were prone to dramatics. And speaking of property," his voice hardened, "I want back what you stole from me, the jewelry, the family heirlooms. Return them, and perhaps we can discuss your future more reasonably." "I didn't steal anything," Rowan said flatly. "I left with nothing but the clothes on my back." "Search the house," Marcus ordered his men, but they found their path blocked by Tom Morrison and his sons, rifles held ready, but not quite pointed at anyone yet. "Nobody's searching anything without proper legal authority," Tom said calmly. "You got a warrant, mister?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "I have a husband's legal right to reclaim his property." "Property?" Martha Henley's voice cut across the tension like a whip crack. She stood in the doorway with her Winchester cradled in her arms, grey hair pulled back severely and her eyes blazing with righteous fury. "Did this man just call a woman property?" "Now see here," Marcus began, but Martha wasn't finished. "I've got 4 daughters and 6 granddaughters," she continued, her voice rising. "And I'll be damned if I stand by while some fancy-dressed pig talks about buying and selling women like they're livestock." A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled defenders, 20 neighbors who had seen enough of bullies and were ready to make a stand. Marcus looked around nervously, clearly realizing that his show of force was badly outnumbered by local sentiment. "This is a legal matter," he said, trying to regain control of the situation. "I have papers." "Papers can be forged," Judah said quietly. "Just like accusations can be made up and witnesses can be bought. Question is, are you going to leave peacefully, or do we need to help you find your way off my land?" For a moment, the 2 men stared at each other across the dusty yard, and Judah could see the calculation happening behind Marcus's smooth facade. This wasn't going according to plan. The isolated rancher and defenseless woman he had expected to intimidate were backed by an entire community ready to fight. Marcus's hand moved slowly toward his coat, and Judah's own hand dropped to the Colt's worn grip. The morning air seemed to crystallize around them, heavy with the promise of violence, as 20 rifles shifted to ready positions. "I wouldn't," Judah said softly, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had seen death and wasn't afraid to meet it again. Not unless you want to find out how fast news travels in a small valley. The standoff stretched like a held breath, two forces balanced on the knife's edge of action, waiting to see who would blink first. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the deadly silence, and all eyes turned toward the road where a lone rider was approaching at a hard gallop. Deputy Marshal Thornton reined in his lathered horse just outside the circle of tension, his face grim as he surveyed the armed standoff. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, dismounting quickly, "I was hoping to catch you before you did something we'd all regret." Marcus turned toward the deputy with visible relief. "Marshal Thornton, thank God. This man is harboring my wife and refusing to let me reclaim my stolen property. I demand you arrest him immediately." But Thornton's expression remained troubled as he pulled a telegram from his coat pocket. "I'm afraid it's not that simple, sir. This wire came in from Helena this morning. Seems there are some questions about your legal standing in this matter." "Questions?" Marcus's voice rose an octave. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that come up when a man's creditors start talking to federal marshals about his business practices." Thornton's voice was carefully neutral, but his meaning was clear. "Turns out selling your wife to pay gambling debts is frowned upon by the territorial courts, even when you try to dress it up in legal language." The blood drained from Marcus's face, and Judah saw the exact moment when his bluster collapsed into desperate calculation. You can't prove." "Owen Baker signed a sworn statement," Thornton continued relentlessly. "Detailed account of how you offered him your wife in exchange for cancelling your debts. Even showed us the contract you had drawn up, all legal-like. Turns out the territorial judge takes a dim view of treating women like livestock." Marcus's hired men began shifting nervously, clearly realizing they had signed on to collect a runaway wife, not to participate in what was starting to sound like kidnapping and human trafficking. One by one, they began backing toward their horses. "Furthermore," Thornton said, warming to his subject, "there's the matter of the false accusations about stolen jewelry. Seems Mrs. Whitmore never owned any family heirlooms, seeing as how you sold off everything of value months ago to cover your gambling losses." "This is preposterous," Marcus sputtered, but his voice lacked conviction now. "I have rights as her husband." "Had rights," Thornton corrected, past tense. "The territorial court issued an emergency dissolution this morning, citing abandonment, physical abuse, and attempted sale of a spouse. Your marriage is legally void, Mr. Whitmore." The words hit the assembled crowd like a thunderclap. Rowan swayed on her feet, and Judah caught her elbow, steadying her as the reality sank in. She was free. Truly, legally free, with no shadow of Marcus's claimed ownership hanging over her future. "That's impossible," Marcus said, but his voice was hollow now. "Courts don't move that fast." "They do when a federal marshal takes an interest," Thornton replied. "Seems the territorial government is cracking down on men who think they can buy and sell human beings like property. You're lucky they're not pressing criminal charges." Marcus looked around desperately, seeing his support crumbling, his men already mounted and ready to ride away from what had become a legal disaster rather than a simple wife retrieval. "You don't understand," he said, his composure finally breaking completely. "I owe money to dangerous people. If I don't bring her back, then you'd better figure out another way to pay your debts," Judah said coldly, "because she's not going anywhere with you. Ever." "She's nothing," Marcus exploded, his mask of civilization finally slipping to reveal the cruel, desperate man underneath. "A worthless woman who can't even give a man children. You can have her, she's more trouble than she's worth anyway." The insult hung in the air like poison, and Judah felt rage rise in his chest, so pure and clean it was almost calming. His hand moved to the Colt's grip, and he saw Marcus's eyes widen with sudden fear. "You're going to want to be very careful about your next words," Judah said quietly, "because I've got 20 witnesses here who just heard you admit to trying to sell a woman like cattle, and there's not a jury in the territory that would convict me for defending her honor." But before the confrontation could escalate further, Rowan stepped forward, her back straight and her voice clear as bell. "No, Judah, he's not worth it. She walked down the porch steps with measured dignity, stopping just out of Marcus's reach. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of a woman who had finally found her strength. "You're right about one thing, Marcus," she said. "I couldn't give you children, but you never asked why. You never wondered if maybe the problem wasn't with me, but with the fear and stress of living with a man who saw me as property instead of a person." She gestured toward Judah, toward the neighbors who had rallied to defend her, toward the simple ranch house that had become her sanctuary. "These people see me as a human being with worth and dignity. They've shown me what real love looks like, what partnership means, what it feels like to be valued for who I am, instead of what I can provide." Marcus started to speak, but she held up her hand, silencing him with the sheer force of her conviction. "I pity you," she said simply, "because you had the chance to love and be loved, and you threw it away for gambling and cruelty and the need to control. You'll spend the rest of your life wondering what you could have had if you'd just been decent." She turned her back on him then, the ultimate dismissal, and walked to where Judah waited. He extended his hand, and she took it without hesitation, their fingers intertwining with the natural ease of two people who belonged together. "Marshal," she said to Thornton, "I believe Mr. Whitmore and his men were just leaving." Marcus stood frozen for a moment, clearly struggling with the complete collapse of his plans. But with his legal position in ruins and 20 armed neighbors watching his every move, he had no choice but to retreat. "This isn't over," he said weakly, but the words carried no conviction. "Yes," Rowan said firmly, "it is." Within minutes, Marcus and his remaining men were gone, leaving nothing but dust and the lingering memory of defeated arrogance. As their carriage disappeared down the valley road, Judah turned to Rowan and pulled 2 simple rings from his pocket bands of iron he had forged himself from ore found on their land. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Properly this time, with witnesses and celebration and all the trimmings?" "Yes," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, their neighbors erupted in cheers and applause, the tension of the morning dissolving into joy and relief. They were free, they were together, and they had a whole community ready to celebrate their new beginning. 6 months later, Judah Cain stood on his porch in the golden light of early autumn, watching his wife hang laundry on the line behind their house. The sight still had the power to stop him in his tracks, the easy grace of her movements, the way she hummed softly while she worked. The simple domestic miracle of sharing his life with someone who made every ordinary moment feel like a gift. Rowan had changed in the months since their wedding, growing stronger and more confident with each passing day. The fearful woman who had collapsed in his yard during that February storm was gone, replaced by someone who could gentle a spooked horse, deliver a difficult calf, and run a ranch with the best of them. But it was more than just competence moved through the world now, with the quiet assurance of a woman who knew her own worth. "Judah," she called, turning from the clothesline with a smile that still made his heart skip. "Come see what I found." She gestured toward the small garden plot behind the house, where late summer vegetables grew in neat rows she had planted and tended with patient care. But it wasn't the tomatoes or squash that had caught her attention. It was a pair of tiny boots, no bigger than his palm, sitting on the garden wall like they had been placed there by careful hands. "Where did those come from?" he asked, though something in her expression was already giving him the answer he hardly dared hope for. "I bought them in town yesterday," she said, her voice soft with wonder. "From Mrs. Patterson's shop. She said they were the smallest ones she had, but they might still be too big for a while yet." The implication hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his knees weak. He reached out to touch the tiny boots with trembling fingers, hardly able to believe what she was telling him. "Are you saying," he began, but the words stuck in his throat. "I'm saying we're going to need them," she said, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks. "Come spring, there's going to be 3 of us sitting around that kitchen table." He swept her into his arms then, spinning her around while she laughed and protested about being dizzy. When he finally set her down, His own eyes were wet with tears he made no attempt to hide. "Are you sure?" he asked, cupping her face in his hands. "Dr. Henderson confirmed it yesterday, due in early April, he thinks." She leaned into his touch, her expression radiant with happiness. "I wanted to be certain before I told you." He thought about all the years he had imagined this moment, first with Sarah and then alone in the dark nights when grief had convinced him he would never love again, never have the chance to be a father. The dream had seemed impossible for so long that having it offered now felt like grace beyond measure. "I love you," he said fiercely. "Both of you. All of us." "And we love you," she replied, placing his hand over her still, flat belly. "This baby is going to be so lucky having you for a father." They stood there in the autumn sunshine, holding each other and the promise of new life, while around them the ranch hummed with quiet prosperity. The cattle were fat and healthy in the pastures, the barns were full of good hay for winter, and their house gleamed with the care and attention of two people who understood what they had built together. That evening, they sat by the fire with the completed wedding ring quilt spread across their laps, planning the nursery they would need to prepare and talking softly about names and dreams and all the possibilities that stretched out before them. The quilt had become a symbol of their journey. Sarah's interrupted hopes transformed into something new and beautiful, a bridge between past and future that honored what came before while embracing what was to come. "Sarah would have loved this," Rowan said quietly, her hand resting on her belly. "She would have been so happy for us. She would have spoiled this baby rotten." Judah agreed, smiling at the thought. "Probably would have taught him to ride before he could walk, just like she always said she would do with our children." They had learned to speak of Sarah naturally now, without pain or awkwardness, understanding that love didn't diminish when it was shared, but grew larger, encompassing more people and more possibilities than they had ever imagined. The pressed flower in her Bible had become a blessing rather than a burden, and sometimes Rowan would read aloud from the scriptures while Judah worked on ranch accounts, creating new memories in rooms that had once echoed with loneliness. As winter approached and Rowan's pregnancy began to show, the community that had rallied to defend their love now gathered to celebrate their growing family. Martha Henley organized a quilting bee to make baby blankets, while Tom Morrison and his sons built a beautiful cradle from pine wood and careful craftsmanship. Even Deputy Marshal Thornton stopped by occasionally, bringing news from Helena and updates on Marcus Whitmore's continuing legal troubles. "Last I heard, he'd fled the territory," Thornton reported during one visit, "left owing money to half the businessmen in Helena and facing federal charges for his trafficking schemes. You won't be hearing from him again." The news was welcome, but Rowan had long since stopped looking over her shoulder for threats that no longer had power over her. She had found her strength, her voice, her place in the world, and no amount of legal maneuvering or desperate threats could take that away from her now. On a cold December night, as snow fell softly outside their windows and the fire crackled warmly in the hearth, Judah found himself thinking about the woman who had collapsed on his porch nearly a year ago. That frightened, desperate soul seemed like a stranger now, transformed by love and purpose into someone who could face any challenge life might bring. "What are you thinking about?" Rowan asked, looking up from the baby clothes she was mending. "Just remembering," he said. "That night you came to my door, how close I came to not hearing you, not finding you in time." "But you did hear me," she said simply. "You came outside, and you brought me in, and you saved my life in every way that matters." "We saved each other," he corrected gently. "And now we get to save this little one too, give him or her everything we never had but always wanted." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows with the promise of a long winter ahead. But inside their warm house, surrounded by the tangible evidence of the life they had built together, Judah and Rowan Cain held each other close and dreamed of spring.